Welcome to the inner sanctum of the audiobook empire. The person who talks the most in the room is not the most powerful. They are the most anxious. Real power sits in calculated silence and speaks only once, and that single truth alone is enough to redraw the map of every professional relationship you have built until today. 95% of people negotiate in a way that makes the other party win automatically, not because they are weak, but because they do not realize they started losing before they ever open their mouths. And what is more dangerous than the loss itself is the false sense of security that accompanies it. If you need other people's approval to validate your decisions, you have not built an identity yet. You have built a dependency. The person you think is confident in your circle most likely does not possess confidence at all. They possess trained indifference, engineered with precision and deliberate practice. The difference between the two does not reveal itself in ordinary moments. It reveals itself the instant pressure is applied, and everything collapses within seconds. There is one sentence, if spoken at the beginning of any negotiation, that makes the other party feel they're in control, while you are the one orchestrating everything from behind an invisible curtain. This sentence is not magic. It's linguistic engineering built on a deep understanding of how the brain functions under the pressure of decision. And the book you are about to hear today is not taught in MBA programs for one reason only, because it explains how the game works from the inside, in a language never designed for the general public. This content is not for those seeking morning motivation that evaporates before noon. This is for those who have made a final, irreversible decision to understand how social dominance is built scientifically and systematically, far beyond empty slogans and packaged advice. If you are comfortable in your life right now and feel no internal friction whatsoever, close this video. But if you feel there is another level you have not yet reached, a level seen by few and lived by even fewer, continue, because what follows was engineered for you alone. Every single day you pass without understanding these rules, someone else is understanding them and applying them to you in complete silence. This is not a theoretical assumption, and it is not rhetorical exaggeration. This is what is happening right now in every boardroom, at every negotiation table, and in every relationship where one party believes the dynamic is equal. The money you did not earn this month did not vanish into thin air. It went to someone who knows one rule you do not know yet, and it will keep going to them for as long as this cognitive gap remains open. There is a moment that every serious professional has experienced, a moment in which the full weight of a high-stakes negotiation, a heated business dispute, or a personally charged conflict lands simultaneously on their nervous system, their cognitive clarity, and their behavioral composure, and in which the gap between who they believe themselves to be in the abstract and who they actually are under that specific quality and intensity of pressure becomes suddenly, uncomfortably, and consequentially visible. In that moment, the professional who has told themselves that they are calm under pressure, that they handle conflict well, and that their judgment does not degrade when the stakes are highest, discovers with the clarity that no amount of self-assessment conducted in the absence of genuine pressure could have produced, whether those beliefs are accurate descriptions of a developed capability or comfortable self-narratives that the absence of sufficient testing has allowed to remain unchallenged. This discovery is the most important moment in any serious professional's development, not because it is pleasant, not because it is comfortable, and not because it confirms the self-image that professional socialization has consistently rewarded, but because it is accurate. It reveals with the brutal precision that genuine pressure always provides the actual state of the professional's composure capability, not the theoretical level that their self-assessment endorses, but the operational level that the pressure environment has just measured with the most reliable instrument available for that purpose. The Stoic negotiator begins from this moment of honest revelation and builds from it a framework that is neither optimistic about the ease of genuine composure development nor pessimistic about its possibility for any professional who engages with its development with the seriousness and the systematic discipline that genuine operational capability requires. The framework's foundational philosophy is Stoicism, not the popular caricature of Stoicism as emotional suppression or affectless detachment from human experience, but the actual operational philosophy that Marcus Aurelius applied to the governance of an empire under existential military threat that Epictetus developed while navigating the complete absence of external freedom as an enslaved person, and that Seneca deployed in the most politically dangerous environment of the ancient world. These were not people for whom Stoicism was an academic philosophy. They were people for whom it was the operational system that made functioning, deciding, and maintaining genuine psychological sovereignty possible under conditions of pressure that most modern professionals will never approach in their severity. Their Stoicism was not composed of abstract principles held at a comfortable intellectual distance from genuine life pressure. It was a set of precisely calibrated mental practices deployed in real time under genuine pressure that produced genuine composure as their operational output rather than their theoretical claim. The central operational principle of Stoic philosophy, the dichotomy of control, is the foundational cognitive architecture of the Stoic negotiator framework, and its application to professional negotiation and conflict contexts is both more precise and more consequential than its general philosophical formulation suggests. The dichotomy of control states in its philosophical formulation that some things are within our power and some things are not, and that wisdom consists in directing our full attention and energy toward the former while maintaining genuine indifference to the latter. In the specific context of high-stakes professional negotiation and conflict, this principle translates into an operational distinction of extraordinary clarity and extraordinary strategic value. The distinction between the internal variables of the negotiation, which include the negotiator's own cognitive processes, emotional states, behavioral responses, and strategic choices, and the external variables, which include every aspect of the counterpart's behavior, every feature of the negotiation's environmental conditions, and every dimension of the outcome's uncertainty that the negotiator's actions cannot directly determine. The negotiator who has genuinely internalized the dichotomy of control does not merely understand this distinction intellectually, they have restructured their entire attentional and motivational architecture around it, directing the full force of their cognitive and psychological resources toward the internal variables they can actually influence, while maintaining the genuine psychological indifference to external variables that the Stoic framework prescribes, and that the composure under pressure that genuine negotiation mastery requires as its foundational prerequisite. The operational consequence of this restructured attentional architecture is the specific quality of cognitive liberation that the most effective negotiators demonstrate in the most pressure-saturated environments, the liberation of a mind that is not spending any portion of its cognitive resources on managing anxiety about outcomes it cannot control, on monitoring the counterpart's approval of its performance, or on the defensive management of its own emotional reactions to provocations that sophisticated negotiators consistently deploy. Every cognitive resource that the unconditioned negotiator's mind deploys in the service of these anxiety management, approval monitoring, and emotional reaction management functions is a cognitive resource that is unavailable for the strategic analysis, tactical precision, and real-time environmental reading that genuine negotiation excellence requires. The Stoic negotiator's mind, freed from these consuming internal management demands by the genuine internalization of the dichotomy of control, operates with a cognitive availability and a strategic clarity that is simply inaccessible to any negotiator whose composure has not been built on this foundational philosophical architecture. There is a moment that every serious professional has experienced, a moment in which the full weight of a high-stakes negotiation, a heated business dispute, or a personally charged conflict lands simultaneously on their nervous system, their cognitive clarity, and their behavioral composure, and in which the gap between who they believe themselves to be in the abstract and who they actually are under that specific quality and intensity of pressure becomes suddenly uncomfortably and consequentially visible. In that moment, the professional who has told themselves that they are calm under pressure, that they handle conflict well, and that their judgment does not degrade when the stakes are highest, discovers, with the clarity that no amount of self-assessment conducted in the absence of genuine pressure could have produced, whether those beliefs are accurate descriptions of a developed capability or comfortable self-narratives that the absence of sufficient testing has allowed to remain unchallenged. This discovery is the most important moment in any serious professional's development, not because it is pleasant, not because it is comfortable, and not because it confirms the self-image that professional socialization has consistently rewarded, but because it is accurate. It reveals with the brutal precision that genuine pressure always provides the actual state of the professional's composure capability, not the theoretical level that their self-assessment endorses, but the operational level that the pressure environment has just measured with the most reliable instrument available for that purpose. The Stoic negotiator begins from this moment of honest revelation and builds from it a framework that is neither optimistic about the ease of genuine composure development nor pessimistic about its possibility for any professional who engages with it with the seriousness and the systematic discipline that genuine operational capability requires. The framework's foundational premise is that composure under pressure, the specific quality of psychological stability, cognitive clarity, and behavioral sovereignty that the highest performing negotiators and conflict navigators consistently demonstrate in the environments where pressure is most intense and most sustained, is not a temperamental endowment that some people received at birth and others were denied. It is a developed system, a precisely engineered architecture of philosophical principles, psychological practices, and behavioral protocols whose consistent application produces, over time and through sustained practice, the genuine operational composure that natural temperament alone cannot guarantee, and that no amount of intellectual understanding of composure principles can substitute for in the actual pressure environments where operational composure is most consequentially tested. The philosophical foundation of this system is Stoicism, not the popular caricature of Stoicism as emotional suppression or affectless detachment from human experience, but the actual operational philosophy that Marcus Aurelius applied to the governance of an empire under existential military threat, that Epictetus developed while navigating the complete absence of external freedom as an enslaved person, and that Seneca deployed in the most politically dangerous environment of the ancient world. These were not people for whom Stoicism was an academic philosophy. They were people for whom it was the operational system that made functioning, deciding, and maintaining genuine psychological sovereignty possible under conditions of pressure that most modern professionals will never approach in their severity. Their Stoicism was not composed of abstract principles held at a comfortable intellectual distance from genuine life pressure. It was a set of precisely calibrated mental practices deployed in real time under genuine pressure that produced genuine composure as their operational output rather than as their theoretical claim. The central operational principle of Stoic philosophy, the dichotomy of control, is the foundational cognitive architecture of the Stoic negotiator framework, and its application to professional negotiation and conflict contexts is both more precise and more consequential than its general philosophical formulation suggests. The dichotomy of control states in its philosophical formulation that some things are within our power and some things are not, and that wisdom consists in directing our full attention and energy towards the former, while maintaining genuine indifference to the latter. In the specific context of high-stakes professional negotiation and conflict, this principle translates into an operational distinction of extraordinary clarity and extraordinary strategic value. The distinction between the internal variables of the negotiation, which include a negotiator's own cognitive processes, emotional states, behavioral responses, and strategic choices, and the external variables, which include every aspect of the counterpart's behavior, every feature of the negotiation's environmental conditions, and every dimension of the outcome's uncertainty that the negotiator's actions cannot directly determine. The negotiator who has genuinely internalized the dichotomy of control does not merely understand this distinction intellectually, they have restructured their entire attentional and motivational architecture around it, directing the full force of their cognitive and psychological resources toward the internal variables they can actually influence, while maintaining the genuine psychological indifference to external variables that the Stoic framework prescribes, and that the composure under pressure that genuine negotiation mastery requires as its foundational prerequisite. The operational consequence of this restructured attentional architecture is the specific quality of cognitive liberation that the most effective negotiators demonstrate in the most pressure-saturated environments. The liberation of a mind that is not spending any portion of its cognitive resources on managing anxiety about outcomes it cannot control, on monitoring the counterpart's approval of its performance, or on the defensive management of its own emotional reactions to the provocations that sophisticated negotiators consistently deploy. Every cognitive resource that the unconditioned negotiator's mind deploys in the service of these anxiety management, approval monitoring, and emotional reaction management functions is a cognitive resource that is not available for the strategic analysis, tactical precision, and real-time environmental reading that genuine negotiation excellence requires. The Stoic negotiator's mind, freed from these consuming internal management demands by the genuine internalization of the dichotomy of control, operates with a cognitive availability and a strategic clarity that is simply inaccessible to any negotiator whose composure has not been built on this foundational philosophical architecture. There is a specific quality of intellectual error that recurs consistently in every attempt to apply ancient philosophical wisdom to contemporary professional challenges, the error of treating the philosophical text as a source of inspiring quotations to be admired from a safe intellectual distance, rather than as an operational manual to be studied with the same technical precision and the same practical application orientation that any other high-performance operating system demands from its serious practitioners. The Stoic negotiator's mind, freed from these consuming internal management demands by the genuine internalization of the dichotomy of control, operates with a cognitive availability and a strategic clarity that is simply inaccessible to any negotiator whose composure has not been built on this foundational philosophical architecture. There is a specific quality of intellectual error that recurs consistently in every attempt to apply ancient philosophical wisdom to contemporary professional challenges, the error of treating the philosophical text as a source of inspiring quotations to be admired from a safe intellectual distance, rather than as an operational manual to be studied with the same technical precision and the same practical application orientation that any other high-performance operating system demands from its serious practitioners. The Stoic negotiator's mind, freed from these consuming internal management demands by the genuine internalization of the dichotomy of control, operates with a cognitive availability and a strategic clarity that is simply inaccessible to any negotiator whose composure has not been built on this foundational philosophical architecture. Philosophical system not in the comfortable environment of an academic institution, but in the lived experience of enslaved status, whose complete absence of external freedom made the internal freedom that Stoic practice provided not a philosophical preference, but a survival necessity. Seneca refined his philosophical framework while navigating the most politically dangerous court in Roman history, where the consequences of psychological instability were measured not in professional setbacks, but in death. These are not philosophical credentials that recommend Stoicism as an interesting intellectual tradition. They are operational credentials that establish it as a battle-tested composure system whose effectiveness has been validated in pressure environments that modern professional challenges do not approach in their severity. The first principle of the Stoic triad is drawn from Marcus Aurelius, the principle of the obstacle as opportunity, articulated in the Meditations as the recognition that the impediment to action advances action, that what stands in the way becomes the way. In the negotiation context, this principle translates into a specific cognitive reorientation of the professional's relationship to every form of pressure, provocation, and adversarial tactic that the negotiation environment generates. The conventional negotiator experiences pressure as an obstacle to their performance, a force that degrades their cognitive clarity, disrupts their strategic composure, and produces the defensive, reactive behavioral responses that sophisticated counterparts are specifically designing their provocations to elicit. The Stoic negotiator, operating through the obstacle as opportunity principle, experiences the identical pressure as a performance-enhancing input, a clarifying force that strips away the cognitive noise of comfortable, low-stakes thinking and demands the specific quality of focused, precise, essentials-only strategic engagement that genuine pressure makes uniquely available to the mind that has been trained to receive it as an asset rather than a threat. This reorientation is not a positive thinking exercise or a motivational reframe. It is a precise cognitive protocol whose consistent practice produces a genuine restructuring of the nervous system's relationship to pressure stimuli, reducing the threat activation that pressure conventionally produces and increasing the performance activation that the trained Stoic mind has learned to generate from the identical stimulus. The second principle is drawn from Epictetus, the principle of the suspension of judgment, articulated in the Enchiridion as the practice of not allowing the automatic, immediate, pre-reflective evaluation that the mind attaches to every incoming event to determine the quality of the response that event receives. In the negotiation context, this principle translates into the specific cognitive practice of inserting a deliberate gap between the stimulus, the counterpart's provocation, their unreasonable position, their aggressive tactic, their personal attack, and the response that follows it, using that gap to subject the automatic evaluation that System 1 has attached to the stimulus, the deliberate scrutiny that the suspension of judgment requires before that evaluation is allowed to determine the negotiator's behavioral response. The practical deployment of this principle in real negotiation contexts requires a specific cognitive move that Epictetus called the fantasia, the recognition in the moment of stimulus reception that what has just occurred is a raw event whose meaning has not yet been determined, not a pre-interpreted reality whose meaning is self-evident and whose emotional and behavioral implications are therefore automatic and unavoidable. The counterpart, who has just delivered a personally demeaning characterization of the negotiator's position, has produced a specific set of acoustic signals in the air. The interpretation of those signals as a personal attack requiring a defensive response is an evaluation that the negotiator's mind has attached to them automatically, and that attachment can be suspended, examined, and replaced with a more strategically useful evaluation before the response that evaluation would have generated has been executed. The third principle is drawn from Seneca, the principle of premeditation of adversity, articulated across his letters as the practice of deliberately imagining, in advance of any significant engagement, the full range of difficult, provocative, and psychologically challenging events that the engagement might produce, and of mentally rehearsing the Stoic responses to each of them with sufficient vividness and sufficient specificity to reduce the surprise activation that unexpected adversity generates when it arrives without prior mental preparation. In the negotiation context, this principle translates into the specific pre-negotiation practice of adversity scenario mapping, the systematic, deliberate imagination of the most challenging, most provocative, and most psychologically threatening events that the upcoming negotiation might produce, combined with the explicit mental rehearsal of the specific Stoic responses, the suspension of judgment, the dichotomy of control reorientation, the obstacle as opportunity reframe that each imagined adversity scenario would require. This practice is not pessimism, it is the specific cognitive preparation that reduces the nervous system's threat activation response to adverse events by ensuring that when those events arrive, they arrive in a mind that has already processed their occurrence, already prepared its response, and is therefore genuinely, not performatively, unsurprised by their appearance. The triad of these three principles, obstacle as opportunity, suspension of judgment, and premeditation of adversity, constitutes the philosophical architecture whose internalization produces the genuine Stoic composure that no behavioral technique, no communication skill, and no tactical framework can replicate without it, because the composure that these principles generate when genuinely internalized is not a behavioral output that can be produced through the execution of external protocols in the absence of the internal philosophical core. Architecture that generates it authentically. It is the natural behavioral expression of a mind that has genuinely restructured its relationship to pressure, provocation, and adversity through the sustained practice of the Stoic principles that these three masters documented from the lived experience of their own most demanding pressure environments. There is a category of negotiation behavior that the majority of negotiation training frameworks address with insufficient precision and insufficient depth. Insufficient precision because the frameworks that address it typically describe it at a level of generality that makes the identification of its specific manifestations in actual negotiation contexts difficult. And insufficient depth because the frameworks that identify its specific manifestations typically prescribe responses that address the surface behavior without addressing the underlying psychological mechanism that makes the behavior effective against sophisticated targets, who should, by any reasonable assessment of their analytical capabilities, be immune to its influence. This category is deliberate psychological destabilization, the systematic deployment of specific behavioral patterns designed not to advance the substantive content of the negotiation, but to disrupt the cognitive and emotional stability of the counterpart in ways that degrade their strategic performance, compromise their decision quality, and produce the reactive, defensive, emotionally driven behavioral responses that the destabilizing party can exploit for strategic advantage. Understanding this category with sufficient precision to respond to it with genuine Stoic composure requires a complete behavioral taxonomy of its primary patterns, a map detailed enough that each pattern is recognizable in real-time deployment, and specific enough that the Stoic response protocol for each can be developed with the precision that genuine operational effectiveness demands. The first pattern is status assault, the deliberate deployment of verbal and nonverbal behaviors designed to communicate the destabilizing party's assessment of the target's inferior status, inadequate capability, or insufficient authority to participate in the negotiation at the level the target believes they occupy.
Status assault in professional negotiation contexts does not typically take the form of explicit insults, whose overt aggression would be immediately recognizable and whose social unacceptability would undermine the destabilizing party's own positioning. It operates instead through the subtler mechanisms of dismissive response timing, the deliberate delay in responding to the target's communications that communicates their low priority, condescending elaboration of points the target has already made as if the target had not made them, and the strategic deployment of social proof from authorities whose endorsement of positions, contrary to the target's, communicates the target's intellectual isolation from the consensus of sophisticated opinion. The status assault is effective against capable targets, precisely because capable targets have invested significantly in building the professional status that the assault is targeting, making the assault's implicit message that that status is not recognized or respected by the counterpart, a psychologically activating stimulus whose threat to the target's professional identity generates the defensive, status-protecting behavioral responses that the destabilizing party is specifically designing the assault to produce. The second pattern is time pressure manufacturing, the deliberate construction of artificial urgency through the strategic deployment of deadlines, competing offers, expiring opportunities, and the specific interpersonal communication of impatience whose accumulation creates the time-compressed cognitive environment that the urgency instinct section of the factfulness framework established as one of the most reliably effective methods for degrading the quality of the target's analytical engagement. Time pressure manufacturing is particularly effective in negotiation contexts because it exploits the tension between the target's desire to reach a favorable agreement and their awareness that agreement reached under artificial time pressure may be less favorable than agreement reached with the deliberate, unhurried analysis that genuine composure enables. A tension that the manufactured urgency is specifically designed to resolve in favor of the destabilizing party by making the psychological cost of continued deliberation feel greater than the strategic cost of the concessions that premature agreement requires. The third pattern is information ambiguity, the deliberate management of the information environment to create strategic uncertainty about facts, precedents, and conditions that the target needs to evaluate their position accurately, combined with the strategic communication of confidence about the destabilizing party's own assessment of those same facts, precedents, and conditions. Information ambiguity is effective because it exploits the cognitive asymmetry between confidence and uncertainty. A counterpart who appears confidently certain about information that the target is genuinely uncertain about creates the social proof effect that makes the target's uncertainty feel like a deficiency rather than an appropriate epistemic response to genuine informational gaps, motivating the target to resolve their uncertainty by deferring to the confident counterpart's version of the ambiguated information. The fourth pattern is personal boundary violations, the deliberate transgression of the target's personal or professional boundaries through comments, questions, or behavioral intrusions that are sufficiently below the threshold of explicit social unacceptability to resist direct challenge, while being sufficiently above the threshold of comfortable professional interaction to produce the specific quality of social discomfort. Discomfort that boundary violations generate in people whose self-protective instincts have been conditioned by professional socialization to suppress boundary-enforcing responses that might seem disproportionate, confrontational, or professionally inappropriate. The fifth pattern is coalition signaling, the strategic communication through direct statement or indirect implication that the destabilizing party has the support of organizational authorities, market forces, or social consensus whose combined weight makes the target's position not merely strategically weak but institutionally isolated in ways that extend beyond the immediate negotiation into the broader professional environment that the target operates in.
The sixth pattern is emotional mirroring disruption, the deliberate violation of the rapport and emotional synchrony that professional interaction conventionally maintains through the strategic deployment of affective incongruence, responding to the target's collaborative overtures with cold formality, to their formal proposals with inappropriate warmth, and to their emotional expressions with the specific quality of detached clinical observation that communicates that the target's emotional states are being monitored analytically rather than experienced empathetically. Emotional mirroring disruption is effective because it creates the specific quality of interpersonal disorientation that violated social expectations produce. The target whose social interaction framework has predicted a specific quality of reciprocal emotional engagement from a professional counterpart, and who receives instead the deliberate incongruence of disrupted mirroring, experiences a form of cognitive and social dissonance whose resolution requires cognitive resources that are thereby unavailable for the strategic analysis that the negotiation demands. The Stoic response to all six patterns shares a common foundational operation, the immediate application of the suspension of judgment that Epictetus prescribed, creating the cognitive gap between stimulus and response, within which the dichotomy of control reorientation can redirect the target's attentional resources from the pattern's intended activation target. The target's status anxiety time pressure response, uncertainty discomfort, boundary protection instinct, coalition fear, or social synchrony need to the internal variables that Stoic practice places under the negotiator's sovereign control. There is a critical distinction that separates the professional who has intellectually understood the six destabilization patterns from the professional who can actually respond to them with the genuine Stoic composure that converts their intended psychological effect into a strategic advantage for the person they were designed to destabilize. Undermine, a distinction that is not primarily a matter of knowledge, but of practiced protocol, not primarily a matter of understanding what is happening, but of having developed the specific cognitive and behavioral response sequences that operate with sufficient speed and sufficient automaticity to be available in the compressed, high-pressure, real-time conditions of actual negotiation exchanges, where the luxury of deliberate analytical processing is rarely available at the moment when the response is most consequentially needed. The Stoic response protocol bridges this distinction. It is not a philosophical commentary on the destabilization patterns, but a precisely engineered sequence of cognitive and behavioral operations whose consistent practice develops the response capability that genuine Stoic composure in actual negotiation conditions requires, transforming each of the six patterns from a source of performance degradation into a source of the specific strategic intelligence and relative advantage that the Stoic framework converts every adversity into when the philosophical architecture has been sufficiently internalized to make that conversion automatic rather than effortful. The protocol's foundational operation, applicable as the first cognitive step in response to every one of the six patterns, is what the framework calls the Stoic pause, a deliberately engineered version of the response pause that the charismatic framework established, but calibrated specifically for the higher pressure, more psychologically activated conditions that destabilization patterns produce. The Stoic pause is not a delay tactic, and it is not a performance of thoughtfulness. It is a genuine cognitive intervention whose 2 to 4 second duration is sufficient to allow the suspension of judgment that Epictetus prescribed to interrupt the automatic evaluation that the destabilization pattern has triggered, preventing that evaluation from determining the behavioral response before the dichotomy of control reorientation has had the opportunity to redirect the negotiator's attentional resources from the pattern's activation target to the internal variables that Stoic composure places under sovereign control.
The Stoic pause must be practiced in conditions of genuine psychological activation, not in the comfortable low-stakes environments where pausing is natural and effortless, but in the specifically challenging conditions where the activation of the threat response cascade that destabilization patterns are designed to produce creates the genuine internal pressure that the pause must interrupt, because the capability to deploy the pause under genuine activation conditions is the capability that matters in actual negotiation environments, and that capability is only developed through practice that includes genuine activation rather than only comfortable rehearsal. The Stoic response to status assault, the first and most personally activating of the 6 patterns for most professionals whose identity is significantly invested in their professional standing, begins with the Stoic pause and proceeds through a specific cognitive sequence that the framework calls the status re-anchoring protocol. Status re-anchoring is the deliberate cognitive act of returning the negotiator's sense of professional value and capability to the internally grounded foundation of their own genuine assessment of their work, their knowledge, and their position, rather than allowing it to remain anchored to the externally dependent foundation of the counterpart's recognition and validation that the status assault is targeting. The Stoic framework's foundational insight about status, that the only status that genuine composure can be built on is status that does not depend on the recognition of people who have strategic interests in withholding it, translates in the negotiation context into the specific cognitive operation of consciously, deliberately returning the negotiator's sense of standing to its internal foundation in the moment when the status assault is attempting to dislodge it to its external, validation-dependent alternative. The behavioral expression of successful status re-anchoring is not the counter-assertion of the negotiator's status, which would communicate the defensiveness that successful status re-anchoring eliminates, but the specific quality of calm, grounded, unhurried continuation of the negotiator's substantive engagement with the negotiation's substance that communicates through every behavioral channel simultaneously that the negotiator's relationship to the timeline is determined by their own assessment of what the decision requires, rather than by the counterpart's strategic interest in compressing that timeline. The Stoic response to time pressure manufacturing, the second pattern, is the protocol that the framework calls temporal sovereignty assertion, whose operational mechanism directly counters the artificial urgency that time pressure manufacturing creates by explicitly and calmly establishing the negotiator's own relationship to the negotiation's timeline as the authoritative one, rather than the counterpart's manufactured version. Temporal sovereignty assertion does not involve the explicit calling out of the time pressure manufacturing as a tactic, which would shift the negotiation's dynamic from the substantive to the meta-tactical in ways that rarely serve the composure-maintaining negotiator's interests. It involves the behavioral demonstration of genuine indifference to the artificial urgency through the specific quality of unhurried, deliberate, genuinely unrushed engagement with the negotiation's substance that communicates through every behavioral channel simultaneously that the negotiator's relationship to the timeline is determined by their own assessment of what the decision requires, rather than by the counterpart's strategic interest in compressing that timeline. The Stoic response to information ambiguity, the third pattern, is explicit uncertainty acknowledgement combined with independent verification commitment, the deliberate, comfortable, non-defensive communication that the negotiator's decision will be based on information whose reliability they have independently verified, rather than on confident assertions whose source has a strategic interest in the conclusions they support. The Stoic response to personal boundary violations, the fourth pattern, is the calm, specific, non-escalating boundary assertion. Names the violation without dramatizing it, and establishes the behavioral expectation without threatening it.
A response whose composure communicates that the boundary being asserted is genuinely held rather than defensively projected. The Stoic response to coalition signaling, the fifth and most subtly destabilizing pattern, is the explicit, calm engagement with the coalition's actual evidential relevance to the specific negotiation point being made, a response that neither dismisses the coalition's existence nor accepts its authority without the critical evaluation that genuine intellectual independence requires. The Stoic response to emotional mirroring disruption, the sixth and most subtly destabilizing pattern, is the deliberate maintenance of the negotiator's own authentic emotional baseline, regardless of the incongruent responses that the disruption deploys, refusing to be pulled into either the defensive overmatching of the counterpart's emotional register or the anxious accommodation of the disrupted mirroring that social synchrony instincts would otherwise motivate. The consistent application of these 6 pattern-specific response protocols, built on the foundational Stoic pause and the dichotomy of control reorientation that each pause enables, produces the integrated response capability that genuine Stoic composure in actual negotiation environments requires. A capability that converts every destabilization attempt from a source of performance degradation into a source of the relative strategic advantage that the Stoic negotiators' maintained composure generates against every counterparts whose destabilization tactics have failed to find the psychological vulnerabilities they were designed to exploit. There is a dimension of negotiation performance that the preparation frameworks, the tactical repertoires, and the psychological composure protocols that constitute the majority of serious negotiation development address with conspicuous inadequacy. A dimension whose neglect produces a specific and predictable pattern of performance degradation in extended high-stakes negotiations that is so consistently observed across professional domains, organizational contexts, and individual capability levels that its systematic exclusion from negotiation development programs must be understood as one of the most consequential structural gaps in the professional preparation of anyone whose career requires the navigation of negotiations whose duration and intensity are themselves strategic instruments deployed by counterparts who understand that time, exhaustion, and the progressive depletion of cognitive resources are among the most reliable and most widely applicable destabilization tools in the sophisticated negotiator's arsenal. This dimension is cognitive endurance, the specific capability to maintain the full quality of analytical clarity, strategic precision, and decision accuracy across the complete temporal arc of an extended negotiation session, rather than merely in its opening phase, when cognitive resources are freshest and the composure protocols are operating at their peak effectiveness before the sustained demands of the negotiations pressure environment have begun the progressive depletion that every high-stakes extended engagement produces in professionals whose cognitive resource management has not been specifically developed for the endurance demands that the most challenging negotiation environments impose. The cognitive endurance challenge in extended negotiation is rooted in the same neurological reality that the progressive exhaustion section of the mental shielding framework established as a primary manipulation mechanism. The fact that the prefrontal cortical functions that support the highest quality analytical and decision-making processes are among the most metabolically expensive cognitive operations the brain performs, and among the most sensitive to the depletion effects that sustained high-demand cognitive engagement, emotional activation, and interpersonal pressure produce over extended periods. The negotiator who enters a complex, high-stakes negotiation session at 10 o'clock in the morning with their full complement of cognitive resources available is a categorically different strategic performer than the same negotiator at 4 o'clock in the afternoon of the same session, after 6 hours of sustained analytical engagement, emotional regulation, tactical processing, and the continuous deployment of the composure protocols that the session's pressure dynamics have demanded. not because their knowledge, their experience, or their strategic understanding has diminished, but because the cognitive substrate through which all of those capabilities are expressed has been progressively depleted by the sustained demands of the session in ways that measurably degrade the quality of every cognitive output the depleted substrate produces. The sophisticated counterpart, who understands this depletion dynamic, and sophisticated counterparts consistently do, whether through explicit knowledge of the neurological mechanisms or through the intuitive behavioral reading that extensive negotiation experience produces, will deploy the session's structure, pacing, and content sequencing as deliberate instruments of cognitive depletion management, positioning the most consequential negotiation decisions at the points in the session timeline where the target negotiator's cognitive resources are most depleted and therefore most susceptible to the quality degradation that depletion produces in analytical precision, strategic clarity, and resistance to influence. The concession that seems reasonable at 4 o'clock in the afternoon of a 6-hour session is frequently a concession that the same negotiator's morning cognitive state would have recognized as unnecessary, strategically premature, or insufficiently grounded in the careful analysis that the morning state's full cognitive resources would have applied to it before the concession was executed. The Stoic cognitive endurance framework addresses this depletion dynamic through 3 integrated resource management strategies, whose combined application produces the cognitive resource sustainability that the endurance demands of extended high-stakes negotiations require. The first strategy is what the framework calls Stoic cognitive pacing, the deliberate management of the intensity and quality of cognitive engagement across the session's temporal arc, in ways that preserve sufficient cognitive resource availability for the session's most consequential decision moments, regardless of when in the session's timeline those moments occur. Stoic cognitive pacing requires the explicit identification before the session begins of the anticipated decision points and analytical demands that the session will likely generate, and the deliberate calibration of cognitive investment in each phase of the session based on the anticipated resource requirements of subsequent phases, investing maximum cognitive intensity in the session's highest leverage moments, rather than deploying it uniformly across the session's full temporal arc, in ways that deplete the resources that those high-leverage moments specifically require. The second strategy is strategic micro-recovery, the deliberate deployment of brief but precisely calibrated recovery interventions within the session's natural pause opportunities, breaks, document review periods, side conversations, and the specific temporal spaces that every extended negotiation generates to restore the cognitive resource levels that the preceding phase of the session has depleted before the session's next high-demand phase begins. Strategic micro-recovery is not the passive use of session breaks for social conversation or logistical management. It is the active, deliberate application of the specific physiological and psychological recovery practices that produce maximum cognitive resource restoration in the minimum available time, ensuring that the negotiator returns from every break at a higher cognitive resource level than they would have achieved through passive rest alone, and therefore in a stronger cognitive position for the session's subsequent demands than their depletion trajectory without the recovery intervention would have produced. The third strategy is the Stoic indifference to temporal pressure, the practiced, genuine, philosophically grounded indifference to the session's duration and the fatigue that duration produces, built on the Stoic principle that the only performance dimension that the negotiator can actually control is the quality of their engagement with the present moment of the session, rather than the cumulative effect of all previous moments on their current cognitive state. The Stoic negotiator who has genuinely internalized this principle does not experience the 4th hour of an extended negotiation session as the 4th hour of accumulated fatigue whose weight is added to the cognitive demands of the current moment. They experience it as simply the current moment, whose demands are what they are, and whose response is within the negotiator's sovereign control, regardless of what has preceded.
This temporal presence, the Stoic practice of engaging fully and freshly with each moment of the negotiation as a discrete present event, rather than as the latest installment in a fatiguing cumulative sequence, is both philosophically grounded in the Stoic emphasis on the present moment as the only domain of genuine human agency, and neurologically supported by the research on mindful engagement's effects on cognitive resource conservation and restoration. There is a paradox at the heart of high-stakes negotiation that the majority of negotiation frameworks acknowledge in the abstract, but fail to address with sufficient operational depth to make the acknowledgement strategically useful. The paradox that the negotiator who most genuinely needs the agreement they are seeking is the negotiator who is least likely to obtain it on terms that reflect their actual interests, while the negotiator who most genuinely could walk away from the agreement without significant consequence is the negotiator who most consistently obtains agreements on terms that reflect the full strength of their actual strategic position. This paradox is not a cynical observation about the perversity of negotiation dynamics. It is a precise description of the psychological mechanism through which need communicates itself through behavioral channels that the counterpart's social assessment system reads automatically and accurately, producing a corresponding adjustment in the counterpart's assessment of the needing negotiator's leverage, their resistance to pressure, and the concessions they can be moved to make through the strategic application of the patience, the delay, and the credible threat of no agreement that the counterpart's genuine strategic indifference makes available as tactical instruments whose deployment the needing negotiator's psychological condition makes genuinely threatening rather than merely performative. The concept of strategic indifference in the Stoic negotiation framework is grounded directly in the Stoic philosophical principle of preferred indifference, Epictetus's precise formulation of the relationship between the things that genuinely matter to human flourishing and the things that are conventionally valued, but whose absence does not actually compromise the quality of the philosophical life. In the negotiation context, this principle translates into a specific psychological discipline, the deliberate, philosophically grounded cultivation of genuine indifference to the specific agreement being negotiated. Not in the sense of indifference to the professional objectives that the agreement is designed to serve, but in the sense of indifference to this specific agreement with this specific counterpart on this specific timeline as the necessary vehicle for achieving those objectives. The negotiator who has cultivated genuine strategic indifference has developed an internalized understanding that their professional objectives can be served through multiple pathways, that this specific negotiation represents one of those pathways rather than the only one, and that the quality of the agreement that this pathway produces
more important than the fact of reaching an agreement through it, a psychological architecture that produces the specific behavioral signature of genuine indifference, whose communication through nonverbal channels represents one of the most powerful leverage-generating signals available in the negotiation environment. The behavioral signature of genuine strategic indifference is categorically different from the behavioral signature of performed indifference, and this distinction is one of the most consequential in the entire Stoic negotiation framework, because the social assessment systems of sophisticated counterparts are precisely calibrated to detect the difference between authentic indifference, whose behavioral expression flows from a genuine psychological state, and performed indifference, whose behavioral expression is a tactical overlay on an underlying psychological state of genuine need that continues to communicate itself through the micro-behavioral channels that conscious performance management cannot fully suppress. The performed indifference of a negotiator who genuinely needs the agreement communicates its inauthenticity through the specific behavioral signatures of suppressed need, the slightly accelerated response timing that eagerness produces beneath its performance of patience,
The specific quality of attentional intensity that a genuinely needed outcome generates in its pursuer beneath the surface of its performed nonchalance, and the characteristic pattern of concession acceleration that appears when the artificially indifferent negotiator's performance begins to break down under the sustained pressure of a counterpart whose genuine indifference provides the patience to wait for exactly that breakdown. The cultivation of genuine strategic indifference requires a specific preparatory practice whose implementation precedes every significant negotiation and whose consistent execution produces over time the genuine psychological architecture of indifference that genuine leverage generation requires. This practice is what the framework calls the BATNA deepening protocol, not merely the conventional identification of the best alternative to a negotiated agreement that standard negotiation preparation prescribes, but the deliberate, thorough, and emotionally vivid development of the alternative pathway to the negotiator's objectives, whose genuine quality and genuine accessibility produces real rather than performed indifference to the specific agreement being negotiated. The conventional BATNA identification produces an intellectual understanding that alternatives exist. The BATNA deepening protocol produces a genuine psychological experience of those alternatives as viable, attractive, and fully sufficient pathways to the negotiator's objectives, whose availability the negotiator has explored with sufficient depth and specificity to feel genuinely confident in their quality rather than merely intellectually aware of their existence.
The second component of strategic indifference cultivation is the Stoic outcome decoupling practice, the deliberate separation of the negotiator's psychological well-being, professional identity, and sense of strategic competence from the specific outcome of any individual negotiation, grounded in the Stoic philosophical principle that the only outcomes that genuinely matter to human flourishing are the internal ones, the quality of the negotiator's thinking, the integrity of their process, and the authenticity of their engagement, rather than the external ones, whose occurrence is ultimately determined by variables that the dichotomy of control places outside the negotiator's sovereign domain. Outcome decoupling is not the elimination of the negotiator's investment in achieving favorable outcomes. It is the specific restructuring of that investment from a psychological dependency whose frustration produces the composure compromising desperation that need communicates behaviorally into a professional preference whose non-fulfillment in any specific instance is a manageable professional disappointment rather than a psychologically destabilizing threat to the negotiator's sense of capability and worth. The strategic value of genuine indifference in negotiation contexts extends beyond its leverage-generating behavioral signature into the specific quality of cognitive liberation that genuine indifference produces in the negotiator's real-time analytical and decision-making processes. The negotiator who genuinely does not need this specific agreement is a negotiator whose analytical engagement with the negotiation's substance is not being contaminated by the need-driven cognitive distortions that the mental shielding framework established as the primary mechanism through which emotional investment in specific outcomes degrades the quality of the analytical processes that optimal negotiation performance requires. Their assessment of the counterpart's positions is not filtered through the confirmation bias of a mind that needs those positions to be manageable. It is the genuinely clear-eyed assessment of a mind whose freedom from outcome dependency gives it the analytical sovereignty that genuine strategic clarity requires.
There is a specific tactical deployment in the negotiation repertoire of sophisticated professional negotiators that is simultaneously the most emotionally activating, the most difficult to respond to composedly without prior specific preparation, and the most informationally rich for the trained Stoic observer, who has developed the specific analytical capability to read it accurately rather than react to it automatically. A deployment whose surface presentation is the expression of genuine emotional disturbance, but whose actual character, in its most strategically sophisticated manifestations, is a precisely calibrated performance whose every parameter has been selected for its predicted effect on the target negotiator's psychological state, cognitive clarity, and behavioral composure, rather than for its accuracy as an expression of the deploying negotiator's actual internal emotional experience.
Deployment is manufactured anger, the strategic simulation of genuine emotional disturbance for the specific purpose of producing in the target negotiator the psychological responses that genuine anger from a significant counterpart reliably generates: the anxiety of having caused offense, the guilt of having created conflict, the social pressure to repair the relationship through the accommodative concessions that the angry party's distress seems to be demanding, and the specific cognitive disruption that the emotional intensity of an angry confrontation produces in the target's analytical processes precisely at the moment when analytical clarity is most strategically consequential. The behavioral distinction between genuine anger and manufactured anger is one of the most consequential discriminative capabilities of the Stoic negotiator's analytical repertoire. Consequential because the optimal response to genuine anger is categorically different from the optimal response to manufactured anger, and the negotiator who responds to manufactured anger as if it were genuine has already surrendered the strategic advantage that the accurate discrimination would have preserved. Genuine anger in a negotiation context, however inconvenient and however challenging to navigate with composure, is a genuine emotional signal carrying genuine information about a real breach, a real violation of an expectation, a real transgression of a value, or a real frustration of a legitimate interest that the Stoic negotiator's response must engage with at the level of the genuine concern that the anger is expressing, rather than at the level of the anger's emotional intensity, which is the level that unexamined reactive responses habitually engage with. Manufactured anger is a tactical instrument whose informational content is not about the deploying negotiator's actual emotional state, but about their strategic assessment of the target's psychological vulnerabilities and the specific form of pressure most likely to exploit them, an assessment that the target negotiator who can read the manufacture has converted from a source of strategic disadvantage into a source of strategic intelligence about the deploying negotiator's tactical orientation and the specific vulnerabilities they believe their target possesses. The behavioral signatures that distinguish manufactured anger from genuine anger are detectable through the systematic application of the multi-level observational capability that the Mental Shielding Framework's room reading section established, the simultaneous monitoring of content, relational, and influence levels of the interaction, whose integrated analysis produces a picture of what is actually occurring that is more accurate than any single level's information alone could provide. At the content level, manufactured anger is typically characterized by a specificity of grievance that is disproportionately precise for a spontaneously generated emotional response. Genuine anger tends to be globally activated, producing a broad, somewhat unfocused expression of disturbance that encompasses multiple related grievances. Grievances simultaneously. Manufactured anger tends to target a specific, strategically selected point whose concession or accommodation would most directly advance the manufacturing negotiator's substantive interests, revealing the tactical calculation beneath the emotional surface. At the relational level, manufactured anger is characterized by a specific quality of controllability that genuine anger rarely exhibits in its acute phase. The manufacture of angry party retains a degree of behavioral precision, conversational tracking, and strategic awareness of the interaction's dynamics that genuine acute anger consistently compromises, producing the specific behavioral incongruencies of an apparently furious person who nonetheless continues to manage the conversation's structure, content, and pacing with the precision of someone whose analytical faculties are fully operational beneath the emotional display. At the influence level, manufactured anger is characterized by the specific targeting pattern that reveals its tactical function. The anger's expression is calibrated to activate the specific emotional vulnerabilities, social compliance instincts, and conflict avoidance motivations that the manufacturing negotiator's assessment of their target has identified as the pressure points most likely to produce the accommodative response that the anger is designed to elicit. The Stoic response protocol for manufactured anger begins with the foundational Stoic pause, the deliberate interruption of the automatic social anxiety response that another person's apparent anger reliably activates in the socially conditioned professional, and proceeds through the specific analytical sequence that the framework calls the anger authenticity assessment. The anger authenticity assessment applies the three-level observational analysis to the angry display in real time, using the behavioral incongruencies between the content, relational, and influence levels of the display to generate a working hypothesis about whether the anger is genuine or manufactured, a hypothesis that does not require certainty to be strategically useful, but only a sufficient probability estimate to inform the calibration of the response protocol toward the genuine anger end of the spectrum or the manufactured anger end. The Stoic response to confirmed or suspected manufactured anger is what the framework calls the composed acknowledgement, a response that acknowledges the emotional content of the display without accepting its implicit demand for the accommodative concession that the display is designed to produce, and that does so with the specific quality of calm, genuine, non-defensive engagement that communicates the Stoic negotiator's freedom from the social anxiety that manufactured anger is designed to activate. The composed acknowledgement neither dismisses the angry display as irrelevant nor capitulates to its implicit demand for the accommodative concession. It engages with the genuine concern that underlies the tactical deployment, separating the legitimate substantive interest from the tactical emotional vehicle through which it is being expressed, and responding to the former with the analytical precision that the Stoic composure framework provides, while maintaining the behavioral indifference to the latter that strategic indifference makes possible. The conversion of manufactured anger from a destabilization instrument into a strategic intelligence asset is completed by the specific information that successful anger authenticity assessment provides about the manufacturing negotiator's tactical orientation, their assessment of the target's vulnerabilities, their confidence in the tactical deployment's effectiveness, and the specific substantive interests that the anger's targeting pattern reveals as their highest priority concerns in the negotiation's current phase. There is a dimension of negotiation power that operates at a level more fundamental than any specific tactical move, any particular positional strategy, or any individual influence technique in the complete negotiation repertoire. A dimension whose control determines not merely the outcome of specific tactical exchanges within the negotiation, but the psychological architecture of the entire interaction, shaping every participant's cognitive state, emotional baseline, and decision-making quality through the pervasive, continuous, largely invisible influence that the negotiation's pace and rhythm exert on the nervous systems of everyone engaged in it. This dimension is negotiation tempo,
the specific quality of the interaction's speed, its rhythm, its patterns of acceleration and deceleration, and the distribution of its silences, its exchanges, and its transitions across the session's temporal arc. And its control by the Stoic negotiator constitutes one of the most consequential and most consistently underappreciated strategic advantages available in the complete negotiation framework, because the negotiator who controls tempo controls the psychological environment within which every other tactical and strategic element of the negotiation operates, shaping that environment to favor their own cognitive strengths and composure capabilities, while creating conditions that systematically disadvantage counterparts whose performance depends on the specific tempo conditions that the controlling negotiator has the power to deny them. The relationship between negotiation tempo and psychological state is both neurologically grounded and experientially familiar to any professional who has participated in enough high-stakes negotiations to observe the pattern with sufficient consistency to recognize it as a reliable feature of negotiation dynamics rather than a coincidental association. Fast tempo negotiations, interactions characterized by rapid exchange sequences, compressed response times, frequent topic transitions, and the general quality of interpersonal urgency that accelerated pace produces create the specific psychological conditions of time pressure, cognitive load, and analytical compression that favor the negotiator whose preferred decision-making style is intuitive, heuristic-based, and comfortable with the reduced deliberation quality that compressed response times produce. Slow tempo negotiations, interactions characterized by deliberate exchange sequences, extended response pauses, sustained focus on individual topics, and the general quality of interpersonal spaciousness that unhurried pace produces, create the specific psychological conditions of analytical openness, cognitive availability, and deliberative depth that favor the negotiator whose preferred decision-making style is systematic, thorough, and dependent on the full deployment of analytical resources that only adequate temporal space can provide. The Stoic negotiator who understands this relationship and who has developed the capability to establish and maintain their preferred tempo against the counterpart's attempts to impose a different one, has converted tempo control from an accidental feature of specific negotiation dynamics into a deliberate strategic instrument whose deployment consistently creates the psychological conditions that their composure and analytical capabilities are most effectively deployed within. The Stoic philosophical foundation of tempo control is the principle of temporal sovereignty, the genuine, philosophically grounded indifference to the social pressure that accelerated tempo creates in professionals whose relationship to time in social contexts is governed by the approval-seeking, conflict-avoiding, social harmony-maintaining orientations that professional socialization consistently installs as the default behavioral governors of interpersonal pacing. The professional who feels social discomfort when they take longer to respond than the interaction's implicit tempo seems to expect, who experiences the social pressure of a waiting counterpart as a genuine motivational force toward premature response, is a professional whose tempo is being controlled by their social conditioning rather than by their strategic intention, and whose counterpart, if sufficiently sophisticated, can exploit this social conditioning as a reliable mechanism for compressing the target's response quality by maintaining the interpersonal pressure of accelerated tempo expectations. The Stoic negotiator's indifference to this social pressure, the genuine, philosophically grounded freedom from the discomfort that delayed response produces in the socially conditioned professional, is the foundational psychological capability that tempo control requires, because the negotiator who is not free from social tempo pressure cannot control tempo even when they intellectually understand its strategic importance. The practical establishment of Stoic tempo control in actual negotiation sessions proceeds through three specific behavioral mechanisms, whose consistent deployment produces the tempo conditions that the Stoic negotiator's composure and analytical capabilities are most effectively deployed within.
And analytical capabilities are most effectively expressed within. The first mechanism is the response pause protocol, the consistent deployment of the 2 to 4 second Stoic pause before every significant response in the negotiation, regardless of the tempo pressure that the counterpart's expectations, the session's accumulated urgency, or the social discomfort of silence creates. The consistent application of this protocol across the full duration of the session establishes the negotiation's effective response time baseline at the Stoic negotiator's preferred level, rather than at the level that the interaction's social momentum would otherwise produce, creating the deliberate response time environment that analytical quality requires without the explicit assertion of temporal authority that would make the tempo control visible as a deliberate strategic intervention. The second mechanism is topic duration management, the deliberate control of how long the negotiation's attention remains focused on each topic before transitioning to the next, exercised through the Stoic negotiator's consistent practice of completing their substantive engagement with each topic on their own terms, rather than allowing the counterpart's transition attempts to pull the conversation forward before that engagement is complete. Topic duration management is most consequentially exercised in the specific negotiation moments when the counterpart attempts to accelerate past a topic that the Stoic negotiator's analysis has identified as warranting more thorough treatment. The calm, non-confrontational, but entirely firm return to the incompletely treated topic that the Stoic negotiator deploys in response to premature transition attempts communicates through the behavioral signal of its persistent, substantive focus a relationship to the negotiation's agenda that is governed by analytical completeness rather than by social accommodation of the counterpart's preferred pace. The third mechanism is the strategic deceleration intervention, the deliberate, precisely timed reduction of the negotiation's tempo at specific moments of maximum strategic consequence, using the Stoic pause, extended topic engagement, and the specific quality of unhurried, contemplative analytical presence that genuine composure makes available to create the cognitive space that consequential decisions require precisely at the moments when the counterpart's tempo strategy is most aggressively attempting to compress it. The strategic deceleration intervention is the Stoic tempo control framework's most powerful instrument because it operates at the intersection of tempo control and the dichotomy of control. It deploys the Stoic negotiator's genuine indifference to the counterpart's urgency pressure as the psychological foundation for the behavioral deceleration that creates the analytical conditions that genuine strategic clarity requires. There is a cognitive operation that separates the Stoic negotiator from every other professional operating in the same high-pressure, high-stakes negotiation environment, with the same tactical preparation, the same substantive knowledge, and the same genuine commitment to achieving favorable outcomes. An operation that is not a communication technique, not a positional strategy, and not a behavioral protocol in the conventional sense, but a fundamental restructuring of the cognitive relationship between the negotiator and the adverse events that every significant negotiation generates with a consistency and a variety that no amount of preparation can fully anticipate or prevent. This operation is Stoic reframing, the practiced, automatic, genuinely internalized cognitive act of receiving every adverse development in the negotiation not as a threat to be defended against, a setback to be recovered from, or a provocation to be responded to, but as a piece of strategic intelligence to be analyzed, a data point to be integrated into the negotiator's evolving understanding of the counterpart's actual interests, constraints, and tactical orientation, and an opportunity to be recognized and exploited by a mind that has been trained to see the informational content of adversity rather than only its disruptive surface. The negotiator who has developed this cognitive capability is not merely more resilient than their counterpart, they are operating with a fundamentally different and fundamentally richer information set, because every adverse development that their reframing converts into intelligence is an adverse development that the non-reframing counterpart is experiencing only as adversity, losing the informational content that the disruption of their composure prevents them from extracting. The philosophical foundation of Stoic reframing is the Stoic principle that the interpretation of events, rather than the events themselves, is the primary determinant of their psychological impact, a principle articulated by Epictetus in his foundational formulation that it is not things that disturb us, but our judgments about things, and whose application to negotiation adversity produces the specific cognitive discipline of separating the raw event from the automatic evaluation that the mind attaches to this information, the judgment that it is a threat, a setback, a violation, or a defeat, is not a necessary feature of the event's meaning, but an interpretive addition that the negotiator's nervous system generates automatically from its threat detection architecture, and that the Stoic reframing practice replaces with a deliberately constructed alternative. Interpretation whose informational content is more accurate and whose strategic utility is categorically greater than the threat response evaluation it replaces. The practical mechanism of Stoic reframing in real-time negotiation contexts operates through a specific three-step cognitive sequence that the Stoic pause makes available between the adverse event's occurrence and the negotiator's response to it. The first step is the event isolation, the deliberate cognitive act of separating the raw event from the automatic evaluation that the mind has already attached to it, recognizing the evaluation as an addition to the event rather than an inherent property of it, and creating the psychological space within which an alternative evaluation can be constructed. The event isolation is not an easy cognitive operation in the activated conditions that adversity creates. The automatic evaluation is generated with such speed and such compelling felt certainty that its separation from the raw event requires a specific quality of metacognitive awareness whose development through Stoic practice is one of the framework's most demanding and most consequential developmental objectives. The professional who can reliably perform event isolation in the actual pressure conditions of a high-stakes negotiation has developed a cognitive capability that most professionals never acquire, because most professional development frameworks never identify it as a specific trainable skill. The second step is the intelligence extraction, the deliberate analysis of the raw event's informational content about the counterpart's actual interests, constraints, tactical orientation, and psychological state, conducted from the perspective of the Stoic negotiator whose freedom from the threat response evaluation has preserved the analytical availability that intelligence extraction requires. Every adverse development in a negotiation is simultaneously a piece of information about the counterpart. Their aggressive position reveals something about their assessment of their own leverage. Their unexpected demand reveals something about the interests they had not previously disclosed. Their personal attack reveals something about the psychological pressure they are experiencing, and their rejection of a carefully constructed proposal reveals something about the specific features of that proposal that conflict with their actual interests in ways that their stated position had not made visible.
The intelligence extraction step harvests this informational content with the analytical precision that composure enables and that defensive reactivity prevents, producing a richer, more accurate, and more strategically actionable understanding of the counterpart's actual negotiation landscape than the non-reframing negotiator's threat-focused processing of the same events can generate. The third step is the opportunity identification, the deliberate search for the specific strategic opportunities that the adverse event's reframed informational content reveals or creates, conducted from the perspective of a negotiator whose freedom from the threat response evaluation has preserved the analytical availability that intelligence extraction requires. The opportunity identification repurposes the adverse development as a trigger for strategic action rather than as a signal for defensive reaction, producing a conversational response that advances the Stoic negotiator's concrete interests in ways that a conventional defensive reaction could never achieve, even while preserving the professionalism and the psychological safety of the negotiation environment in ways that harnessing the threat response impulse has proven historically unable.
Stoic indifference to the adversity's surface disruption has preserved the strategic creativity that opportunity identification requires. The counterpart's aggressive position, reframed as information about their leverage assessment, may reveal an overestimation of their actual leverage that the Stoic negotiator can exploit through the strategic disclosure of information that recalibrates that assessment in ways that shift the negotiation's power dynamic. Their unexpected demand, reframed as information about previously undisclosed interests, may reveal a pathway to a creative solution that addresses those interests in ways that also advance the Stoic negotiator's own substantive objectives more effectively than the original negotiation trajectory was producing. Their personal attack, reframed as information about their psychological pressure, may reveal a level of internal constraint or external accountability that the Stoic negotiator's strategic patience can exploit through the disciplined maintenance of their position against a counterpart whose internal pressure is already creating the concession motivation that continued patience will eventually make explicit. The consistent practice of this three-step reframing sequence, event isolation, intelligence extraction, and opportunity identification, converts the Stoic negotiator's composure from a defensive capability that protects their performance from disruption into an offensive capability that actively generates strategic intelligence from the adversity that disrupts their counterpart, producing a compounding informational advantage that grows with every adverse event the negotiation generates, and that the non-reframing counterpart's reactive processing is simultaneously destroying rather than building. There is a specific category of conflict that places the Stoic composure framework under a qualitatively different and, in many ways, more demanding test than any professional negotiation context. A category in which the philosophical architecture of indifference, reframing, and dichotomy of control that produces composure in business negotiations must operate against a set of emotional activation conditions that are categorically more intense, more personally penetrating, and more resistant to the philosophical disciplines that professional distance makes more accessible in commercial contexts. This category is personal conflict, the disputes, disagreements, and relational confrontations that occur within the intimate professional partnerships, the close personal relationships, and the family dynamics, whose emotional significance to the participants extends far beyond the financial and strategic consequences that business negotiation outcomes produce, into the domain of fundamental human needs for belonging, recognition, love, and the specific quality of relational security that the threat of conflict in intimate relationships generates. Relationships places at risk in ways that no business deal's failure can replicate. The Stoic negotiator, who has developed genuine composure capability in professional negotiation contexts, and who enters a serious personal conflict with the expectation that the same philosophical tools will transfer automatically to the personal domain without the specific adaptations that its categorically different emotional landscape requires, will discover with the uncomfortable precision that genuine pressure always provides that the philosophical architecture whose internalization was sufficient for professional contexts requires significant recalibration for the specific conditions of personal conflict. Conditions in which the activation intensity is higher, the philosophical indifference is harder, and the consequences of composure failure are not measured in financial terms, but in the permanent relational damage that emotional escalation in intimate contexts consistently produces. The foundational difference between professional negotiation and personal conflict from the perspective of Stoic composure application is the difference in the nature of what is actually at stake in each context, not the financial magnitude of the stakes, which may be higher in professional contexts, but the psychological intimacy of what the stakes represent to the person experiencing them. In a professional negotiation, the outcomes at stake, financial terms, contractual conditions, strategic positioning, are significant to the negotiator's professional interests, but are generally not threatening to the foundational psychological structures of identity, belonging, and relational security that personal conflict places at risk. The business negotiation, whose outcome is unfavorable, can be processed as a professional setback, learned from and recovered from, without its adverse outcome threatening the negotiator's sense of being genuinely valued, genuinely known, or genuinely secure in the relational context that their fundamental psychological well-being depends on. The personal conflict, whose outcome is damaging to the relationship in which it occurs, threatens precisely those foundational psychological structures, the sense of being genuinely valued by a person whose valuation matters fundamentally, the sense of being genuinely known by a person whose knowledge of the self constitutes an irreplaceable component of the self's own self-understanding, and the sense of being genuinely secure in a relational context whose security is not replaceable through professional achievement or strategic maneuvering. This difference in the psychological intimacy of what is at stake produces a corresponding difference in the intensity of the emotional activation that personal conflict generates, an intensity that the Stoic framework must address through specific adaptations that acknowledge the legitimate depth of personal relational investment, rather than treating it as a philosophical weakness to be overcome through the same indifference discipline that professional negotiation composure requires. The Stoic framework's application to personal conflict is not the elimination of genuine caring about the relationship and the person at the conflict's center. That elimination would represent not Stoic wisdom, but Stoic parody, the philosophical caricature that Stoicism's popular misconception consistently produces. It is the specific discipline of separating the genuine, appropriate, philosophically legitimate caring about the relationship from the reactive, escalating, composure-destroying emotional responses that the conflict's activation of that caring produces when the dichotomy of control has not been applied to distinguish between the aspects of the conflict that the caring person can actually influence through their response and the aspects that their reactive escalation will make worse rather than better. The dichotomy of control in personal conflict contexts draws a specific and consequential distinction: the distinction between the quality of the caring person's own engagement with the conflict, which is within their sovereign control, and the other person's emotional state, their chosen behavior, and their ultimate response to the conflict's resolution attempt, which is not. The Stoic approach to personal conflict does not attempt to control the other person's experience of the conflict. It focuses the full force of the caring person's intentional capability on the quality of their own presence in the conflict, their own honesty in the conflict, and their own compassion in the conflict,
while maintaining the genuine Stoic indifference to the other person's response that freedom from outcome dependency requires. This indifference is not coldness. It is the philosophical discipline that prevents the urgent need to control the other person's response from distorting the quality of the engaging person's own presence, honesty, and compassion in ways that make the response less likely to be the one that genuine care for the relationship is hoping to produce. The specific Stoic practices that personal conflict application requires include the premeditation of emotional activation, the deliberate prior-to-conflict imagination of the specific emotional responses that the conflict's anticipated content will activate, and the mental rehearsal of the Stoic pause and reframing protocols in response to each anticipated activation, reducing the surprise intensity of actual activation when it occurs. They include the values clarification practice, the explicit pre-conflict articulation of what the caring person most genuinely values about the relationship and the person at the conflict's center, used as the philosophical anchor that the dichotomy of control reorientation returns to when the conflict's emotional intensity threatens to replace the values-based engagement with the reactive, escalating responses that unchecked activation produces. And they include the outcome decoupling practice, the deliberate cultivation of genuine acceptance of the full range of outcomes that genuine, compassionate, stoically composed engagement with the conflict might produce, including the outcomes that genuine care for the relationship most hopes to avoid, whose acceptance does not represent the abandonment of that care, but the philosophical freedom from outcome dependency that allows the caring person's engagement with the conflict to be determined by their values rather than by their fears. The Stoic composure that personal conflict application produces is not the composure of a person who does not care. It is the composure of a person who cares so genuinely and so deeply that they refuse to allow the reactive distortions of emotional escalation to corrupt the quality of their engagement with the most important relationships in their professional and personal life. There is a specific category of professional conflict that combines the financial and strategic complexity of high-stakes business negotiation with the psychological intimacy and relational significance of personal conflict in ways that produce a qualitatively unique and qualitatively more demanding composure challenge than either category presents in isolation. A category whose navigation requires the complete integration of every component of the Stoic composure framework simultaneously, deployed against activation conditions that are simultaneously more financially consequential than most personal conflicts and more emotionally penetrating than most purely commercial negotiations. The business partnership dispute is the Stoic composure framework's most demanding test, because it places the philosophical disciplines of indifference, reframing, and dichotomy of control under the simultaneous pressure of financial threat and relational injury, two activation sources whose combined intensity create a psychological environment in which composure is both most difficult to maintain and most consequentially necessary for the quality of the outcomes that the dispute's resolution will produce. The specific psychological complexity of business partnership disputes derives from the structure of the relational investment that genuine professional partnership requires, an investment that is categorically different from the purely financial investment of an arm's-length business relationship and the purely relational investment of a personal friendship, containing elements of both in a configuration whose mixed character creates specific and predictable vulnerabilities that neither purely financial nor purely personal conflict frameworks adequately address. The business partner is simultaneously a person whose financial interests are directly linked to the disputing partner's decisions, a person whose professional judgment and capability the disputing partner has staked their own professional reputation and financial security on, and a person with whom the disputing partner has developed the specific quality of professional intimacy, shared knowledge of each other's professional strengths and weaknesses, shared history of collaborative achievement and difficulty, shared investment in a common vision that transforms a business dispute into something that activates the relational injury responses of personal conflict simultaneously with the financial threat response architecture of professional negotiation. The Stoic composure application to business partnership disputes begins with the explicit acknowledgement of this dual activation structure, the recognition that the dispute is simultaneously activating the financial threat response architecture and the relational injury response architecture, and that the composure protocols required to address each activation source are different enough that their undifferentiated application through a single composure approach will be insufficiently calibrated for the specific demands of each activation source simultaneously. The financial threat activation calls for the strategic indifference protocol, the deliberate cultivation of genuine alternatives, the BATNA deepening practice, and the outcome decoupling discipline that prevents financial outcome dependency from compromising analytical clarity. The relational injury activation calls for the personal conflict protocol, the values clarification practice, the premeditation of emotional activation, and the specific quality of compassionate engagement that genuine care for the partnership relationship warrants, even in the context of a serious dispute, whose resolution may ultimately end that relationship. The most consequential Stoic discipline in business partnership disputes is the explicit, deliberate separation of these two activation sources and their corresponding response protocols. The cognitive discipline of addressing the financial dimensions of the dispute with the strategic analytical clarity that the composure framework's professional negotiation applications produce, while simultaneously addressing the relational dimensions with the compassionate, values-based engagement that the personal conflict applications prescribe, rather than allowing either activation source to contaminate the response quality appropriate to the other. The most common and most damaging failure mode in business partnership disputes is the contamination of the financial analysis by the relational injury, the pattern in which the hurt, betrayed, or disrespected partner allows their relational emotional activation to distort their assessment of their actual financial interests, their evaluation of their genuine alternatives, and their judgment of the specific terms that would constitute a fair and strategically sound resolution of the financial dimensions of the dispute. The partner who accepts financially damaging terms because the emotional intensity of the dispute has made the relationship's continuation feel more valuable than accurate financial self-representation warrants.
Or who insists on financially punishing terms because the relational injury has made the infliction of damage on the partner feel more motivating than the achievement of their own genuine financial interests, is a partner whose composure failure has produced financial outcomes that serve neither the genuine interests of the relationship nor the genuine interests of their own professional position. The Stoic response to this contamination risk is the deliberate practice of analytical domain separation, the explicit, conscious maintenance of the distinction between the financial analysis of the dispute and the relational engagement with it, conducted through the specific cognitive discipline of periodically returning to the financial analysis from the relational engagement and explicitly asking whether the relational activation is currently distorting the financial assessment in ways that the dichotomy of control reorientation needs to correct.
This practice does not eliminate the relational dimensions from the financial analysis. Genuine professional partnership disputes cannot be resolved through purely financial analysis that ignores the relational context, because the relational context shapes the feasibility, the durability, and the genuine acceptability of financial resolutions, whose technical adequacy as financial solutions does not guarantee their actual workability in the relational environment that the resolution must be implemented within. It ensures that the relational considerations influence the financial analysis through the legitimate channel of genuine contextual relevance, rather than through the illegitimate channel of emotional contamination, whose influence degrades rather than enriches the quality of the financial judgment it distorts. The Stoic negotiator who navigates a business partnership dispute with the complete framework's integration, the strategic indifference of the professional negotiation application, combined with the compassionate values engagement of the personal conflict application, held in the specific balance that the dual activation structure of partnership disputes requires, produces resolutions that are more financially sound, more relationally honest, and more genuinely acceptable to both parties than the emotionally contaminated, analytically degraded resolutions that composure failure in this most demanding conflict environment consistently produces. There is a fundamental misunderstanding about the nature of Stoic composure that produces one of the most consistent and most consequential implementation failures among professionals who have been genuinely persuaded by the framework's philosophical logic and genuinely motivated by its demonstrated effectiveness in the negotiation and conflict contexts that the preceding sections have established. The misunderstanding that Stoic composure is primarily a set of emotions